The animal that built civilization was dinner first. For 50,000 years, your ancestors hunted horses the same way they hunted mammoths, chased them off cliffs, drove them into ravines, cut them open, and ate everything inside. The bones they left behind are still being found today, cracked, burned, and scraped clean with stone tools. And then, somewhere around 6,000 years ago, something changed. One human being made a decision that no human had ever made before. Instead of killing the horse in front of them, they didn't. And what happened next set off a chain of events so consequential that historians still argue about whether anything in human history, fire, agriculture, writing, changed the world as fast or as completely as what came after that single moment. But here is the part that nobody tells you. The people who first rode horses were not the ones who stopped eating them. They were the ones who understood horses so completely. After 50,000 years of hunting them, studying them, learning exactly how they moved, and what scared them, and what calmed them, that they figured out something no predator had ever figured out about its prey. How to become something the horse would choose not to run from. Start with what horses actually were in the ancient world. Not the domesticated version, not the partnership animal, the wild horse, Equus ferus. One of the most successful prey animals on the Eurasian steppe. Fast, powerful, hypervigilant, and fundamentally designed around one behavioral priority: escape. A wild horse can sustain 40 kilometers per hour for long distances. It can detect predators at extraordinary range through a combination of wide-angle vision, acute hearing, and a social alarm system that makes any threat visible to the entire herd within seconds. It sleeps standing up. It can kick with enough force to kill a lion. For most of human prehistory, hunting horses was one of the most dangerous and technically demanding tasks a tribe could attempt. The sites archaeologists have found, Solutré in France, Predmosty in the Czech Republic, show evidence of horse hunting on a massive industrial scale. Thousands of horse bones, decades or centuries of repeated kills at the same location. Entire communities organized around the seasonal movements of horse herds. These people knew horses, not as companions, as prey. In extraordinary detail, they knew the dominant male's behavioral patterns. They knew how the herd moved when frightened versus when merely alert. They knew which terrain channeled horses toward cliffs. They knew the specific sounds and smells that triggered a stampede. That knowledge was going to become the most important technology in human history. But first, it had to spend 50,000 years looking like dinner. Here is the question that archaeologists argued about for decades. Why horses? Of all the large animals that ancient humans hunted, aurochs, mammoths, reindeer, bison, why were horses the ones that eventually became the domesticated partner? Why not the auroch first? Why not the reindeer, which some northern cultures did domesticate for meat and transport? The answer is biological, and it is deeply counterintuitive. Horses are among the most difficult large animals to domesticate successfully. They are prey animals with a startle response that can kill a handler. They require more food than cattle. They are socially complex in ways that make herd management genuinely difficult. But they have one characteristic that no other large animal on the steppe possessed in quite the same way: speed. Not just running speed. The ability to cover distances that were simply impossible for humans on foot. Distances that determined everything about warfare, trade, communication, and political control in the ancient world. Archaeologist David Anthony at Hartwick College spent decades studying the domestication of the horse and identified the crucial transition point at around 3500 BCE in the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea. The evidence he found was not dramatic. It was dental. Horses that had been ridden showed a specific pattern of wear on their premolar teeth, the bit wear produced by the earliest forms of bridle control. Small, subtle marks on ancient bones that rewrote the entire timeline of human civilization. Because here is what riding a horse meant in 3500 BCE. It meant that a human being could cover in one day what previously took a week on foot. It meant that information, armies, and goods could move across the steppe at speeds that made political control of vast territories suddenly possible for the first time. The people who figured out how to ride horses didn't just get faster, they became categorically different from everyone who hadn't. If this is changing how you understand the animal that made civilization possible, hit like. It helps more people find this. And what comes next is the part most history books skip entirely. But how do you go from eating an animal to riding it? This is the question that the textbook version of horse domestication never really answers. It just skips from hunting to riding, as if the transition was obvious. As if one day a human simply decided to climb on a horse's back. The reality was slower, stranger, and far more interesting. The first step was almost certainly not riding, it was keeping. Archaeologists have found evidence of horses being kept in enclosed areas, controlled rather than wild, before there is any clear evidence of riding. The most plausible reason is the most practical one. A horse you have captured is a food source you don't have to hunt. In a world where hunting was dangerous and unpredictable, a penned horse represented caloric security. But something happens when you keep a prey animal in proximity over generations. The animals that were calmer around humans survived and reproduced. The ones that panicked and injured themselves or broke through enclosures were more likely to die or be eaten first. Not through any deliberate selective breeding program, simply through the natural consequence of which animals were easier to keep. Over generations, the horses that remained were subtly different from their wild counterparts. Less reactive, more tolerant of human presence. Not domesticated in any meaningful sense, but changed. And into that changed population, at some point, a human being, almost certainly a young person, because young people attempt things that adults with accumulated caution would not, climbed onto one. What happened next was not graceful. It was probably not successful on the first attempt, or the 10th, or the 50th. Horses are not built to carry riders, and they resist the experience instinctively and violently. But the knowledge of horses that 50,000 years of hunting had produced, the knowledge of their behavioral patterns, their social hierarchies, the specific signals that communicated threat versus safety, that knowledge was now being applied in a completely new context. The hunters who had spent generations learning to predict horse behavior in order to kill horses were now the most qualified humans alive to figure out how to live with them. Now, here is the moment that changed everything. Once riding worked, even imperfectly, even dangerously, even with riders who fell as often as they stayed on, the strategic advantage it produced was so overwhelming that it spread across the steppe with a speed that archaeology can actually measure. The Yamnaya culture of the Pontic steppe expanded across Eurasia in what geneticists studying ancient DNA now describe as one of the largest and fastest migrations in human prehistory. Within a few centuries, Yamnaya genetic signature appears across Europe and Central Asia on a scale that suggests not gradual migration, but rapid displacement. They had horses. Everyone else was on foot. The mathematics of that military asymmetry are not complicated. A mounted warrior covers ground faster than any infantry. A mounted raider can strike and retreat before a defensive response is organized. A mounted messenger can coordinate armies across distances that previously required days of travel. Warfare, trade, and political organization were all transformed simultaneously by the same technology. And that technology had spent 50,000 years being eaten. Go back to the beginning. The animal that built civilization was dinner first. What changed was not the horse. The horse was always what it was. Fast, powerful, and fundamentally designed to escape. What changed was the humans. 50,000 years of intimate knowledge of a prey animal, accumulated through the most practical possible motivation, survival, created the specific understanding that made partnership possible. The Yamnaya riders who crossed the steppe and changed the genetic map of Europe were not visionaries who looked at a wild horse and imagined a partner. They were the descendants of hunters who had spent 50,000 years learning everything there was to know about the animal they were about to transform. The dinner became the vehicle. The prey became the weapon. The animal they had chased off cliffs became the animal that carried them across continents. And the lesson buried inside all of this is stranger than the history itself. The deepest knowledge of anything, the kind of knowledge that eventually produces something extraordinary, almost always begins with the most basic possible relationship: survival. The people who changed the world with horses were not the first people to admire them. They were the first people who had eaten them long enough to understand them completely. Drop a comment. Which do you think mattered more? The 50,000 years of hunting knowledge, or the moment someone first decided not to kill the horse in front of them? I want to see where people land. Subscribe. The next video in this series goes somewhere that will change how you think about every animal that shaped human history.